Hey everyone, this is Blake. Today I'm going to be going over putting together an NC, what it looks like to effectively prepare for that first negative speech, put a doc together, and just some general tips on getting ready and using that prep time effectively. So this is kind of what I believe every good NC document should have. So because now we're getting into some more practical details about putting together a document and stuff like that, we not only need to take into consideration strategy, but we also need to take into consideration the ethics of debate, what kind of stuff it is fair to put in a document that you're going to send to your opponent, and what kind of stuff we should and should not do whenever we are putting together a document that we're going to wind up sharing with an opponent. So taking all these things into consideration, this is kind of what I think is a good outline to follow. So always make sure that you include all the offs, and if you're just reading an NC, that you include the entire case formatted and ordered correctly. Basically, it should be so that your opponent gets it and they can start at the first card at the top of the document and go down, and they'll be understanding everything in order that you are making those arguments. So you're not going to start with the first off and then jump down to the third one in the doc and then move up to the second. Make sure that you're ordering them correctly. That might sound self-explanatory, but you'd be surprised how often people mess up that step. And then as far as the on-case section, you're going to want to split it into parts. I'll talk a little bit about formatting and how to do that. So parts, by which I mean like separate the contentions and the framework and any overview type work you're going to do, separate those into different sections. And within those sections include all carded responses that you're going to read. Any block cards that you're going to read absolutely need to be in that document. And then any arguments that you have that are analytic but are pre-typed, you should include those as well. So obviously a big part of debate is extemping arguments and coming up with them on the fly. So of course those aren't things that you're going to be able to include in the document, but anything that you typed out either during prep time or already had written from like a block file or something like that, you're going to want to include that in the document just to be fair, and to help your opponent understand and follow along with the speech. So some things that we don't want to do with a document: don't include a bunch of cards that you're not going to have time to read. Some people have a habit of just grabbing all of the cards that are in the A2 file and just throwing them all in the document instead of taking the time to really think which of these cards are the most strategic. I'm only going to read this one, or how many cards will I have the time to read, or something like that. And the reason why that's better than just throwing all the cards in the file is because then you're giving your opponent a bunch of extra information that they can use to understand and predict your future strategies or things like that. And also, you're just going to make a cluttered doc that is a lot harder to follow. Try to avoid including incomplete analytics. So if you're somebody that likes to type out arguments in prep time and you just write like turn dash link turn or something like that, sending that is just going to probably confuse and clutter the document. When I say pre-typed analytics, I mean analytics that actually give a justification and an explanation. You can kind of give a kind of shadow outline if you're doing something that's structured. So for instance, if you are going to extemp a theory shell, you should send them a full interpretation, and then for standards you can just put, standard 1 is ground, standard 2 is clash, and then make a note that you're going to be extemping all that analysis. But when it's coming to on-case stuff, make sure that you aren't just throwing random words here and there, because chances are you're not going to be able to shorthand every single argument you're making, and then the opponent is going to be confused about whether that is a complete doc or an incomplete doc in regards to how many arguments you're going to make and things like that. It's just really misleading, so make sure that any analytics that are included are completed. And then don't include anything that you're saving for the NR. So some off-case positions that are written have cards that we expect to be reading in the NR. So for instance, answers to perms, or maybe extra impact defense or something along those lines. Don't flash those in the NC, because that's tipping your hat for the strategy a little bit too early and gives your opponent an unfair advantage. So make sure that if you're not going to read it in that speech, don't include it in the document. So all this might seem a little bit obvious, but again, these are definitely things to keep in mind. People mess them up sometimes, and that's totally okay to make mistakes, but this is what we should be shooting for when we're putting together a document. So some formatting tips, what I mean when I say sectioning off and things of that nature. So Verbatim is an incredible tool that is available to debaters. It's available at paperlessdebate.com. I know some people like to use Google Docs or things of that nature. I believe Verbatim also has an attachment for that. I would strongly recommend that all of you get Verbatim and familiarize yourself with it. And then even some of you that already have it probably don't understand all of the things and the tools that it can do. So I would strongly recommend taking the time to go through and kind of play around with all those different tools and shortcuts and see what they do. So then separate your off case positions with numbers or case type names. So what I mean by case type names is just put DA1 or CP or K or whatever it is. Don't put like a full explanation of the disad or whatever. Again, that's just going to be more clutter and hard to follow. The thing to keep in mind when you're putting section headers is that they should fit in the navigation pane, so that way when you're looking at it, you know what it is. But if it's like DA-nuclear war scenario, blah, 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 and it's got all this description, when you're looking at just the navigation pane, it's going to get cut off at some point and it's going to be confusing. So just try to keep the names short and buzzy so you know what they are when you're just looking at the navigation pane. Order offs based on importance, and what I mean by importance is more so about layering. What you think would be the highest layer should probably go first. So if you're reading T or theory, that should normally be the first off because it's a meta debate question. And then a lot of times I think it's a good idea to put Ks first. Basically anything that you definitely want to emphasize the importance of should go first because the judge is paying the most attention at the beginning. And, you know, ideally they're going to pay attention the whole time, but the first words out of your mouth are going to be the ones that they spend the most time thinking about. So it's really important that those first words and that first off is a important one and is a meaningful one and is a strong one. So make sure that you're paying attention to the order you're putting the offs in. Don't just kind of throw them in there randomly. And then another thing to consider when you're ordering your offs is that if you have like a disad and a counterplan that goes together because the counterplan solves the disad or something of that nature, make sure that they're next to each other. They don't have like another random disad between them or like a K in there or something like that. Make sure that the stuff that goes together stays together. So use the headers tools that are available through Word, particularly Verbatim, again, is great with this to separate on-case sections. So that way the on-case section is not just like a litany of cards that's hard to navigate. Make sure that you delineate them with headers that say like this stuff is for contention 1, this is for contention 2, things like that. And then when you're doing the on-case section, you should order the contentions or the sections based off of the roadmap you give, not the order of the AF. So for instance, you know, before your speech, you're going to say, I'm going to start at the top of the AC and go down. Or you might say on the AF, I'm going to start with contention 3 and then go to the top and do 1 and 2. So order the on-case section in the order that the speech is going to go instead of like 1, 2, 3, because that's the way the AF is ordered. So make sure that the on-case section flows according to the way that you're going to be giving the speech so that you can just follow along in the doc. So I know that some of these are kind of hard to wrap your head around in a vacuum, so I have a sample doc pulled up here. So this is for the September-October topic of 2019, I believe. So this is a 2-off and then case strategy. So you'll see I have Verbatim here. This is the way it looks on my particular version of Word. With the different updated versions of Word, different year, it's going to look differently. But it is really helpful. You see it just has normal like body of the card, and then it has site formatting for the part at the beginning, the name and date. You have this block heading, which is what I used here to separate the contentions. And then you have hats, which are a step above that. So if you look over here at the navigation pane, you can see that they are indented more based on the level of importance. So it's a hat, and then a block is 1 step in, and then a tag is another step in. So it makes it a lot easier to navigate. So when we use these tools effectively, we get this really neat, easy to follow navigation pane and an easy to read document. So this is 2 off, so I just titled the off 1 and 2. You can see that I can scroll down to 2 and it's right there, or if I just click the 2 there, it'll take me there automatically. That's another cool thing about Verbatim and the way it uses the navigation pane. I could just as easily say CP disad, and that's also totally fine, but just the way I set them up, I normally do 1 and 2. And then we have case also in a hat, so that way it's very clear that we're now moving on to the AF. You could also say AC, whatever, lets us know that we are now switching flows onto the case that was red. And then for this one, you can see that for this speech, I would start on contention 3 and then do 1 and 2. So I put contention 3 first. So this is a good example of what I mean by pre-typed analytics. These are pretty thorough explanations of what the arguments are. And I basically, if I were giving this speech, I could just read this and it would be easy to flow. I'm telling you the author and the date of the card I'm on, the claim, and then here's some warrants and impacts and analysis there, and then another card there. So that's a pretty well organized pre-typed analytic. And then moving on to another contention, I have my block header, and then I just have the cards that I'm reading. I have a little bit of analytics, the cards that I'm reading in order, and then same thing for the contention 2. So these are all little minor adjustments, but they make a big difference. And the first time that you are debating with a really well-organized NC doc, you're going to feel how much easier it is to do this navigation. So if somebody asks me, like, what was the second card you read on the ableism contention, I know to go right there, and it's easy to find. So that's a pretty good example of a sample doc. Again, these things can change around slightly, but this shows kind of the core tenets of what I'm talking about with formatting. So now we're going to talk about some of the strategy that is involved with picking the off-case positions you're going to read. Now, if you're somebody that prefers to just read an NC, just framing and contentions, that's totally fine. This part probably won't affect you as much, but I strongly suggest that you familiarize yourself with this stuff anyway, because it's just a good skill set to have, and it helps you put yourself in the right mindset to be an effective and strong debater. So the first question you want to ask yourself when you're picking off-case positions is what framework situation we're dealing with here. If the opponent read a framework that you're totally cool with, that you're just going to wind up conceding to that framework and debating under that framework, then you don't need to do anything. You can just move straight on to your offs. If you know you want to read a counter framing, that should probably be your first off. If you're going to read a K or something that has implicit framing, like a roll of the ballot or something like that, you're going to want to make sure that you decide what K you want to do and decide that framework debate and how those frameworks are going to interact. So framework is obviously the kind of connective tissue for the whole debate. So it's really important that you figure out that question first. It should not be an afterthought like I think it is for some debaters. They just kind of think, I'll throw together my best disads and a good counter plan, and then I'll just find a way to link it to the framework. That should be the first question you're asking yourself, is how can I link this to the framework? What disads apply directly to the framework? What counter plan solves best under that situation? Things like that. The second point I have here is don't push yourself to be more stylistically progressive than you want to be. Sometimes we get the feeling when we're debating that, oh, hey, I feel like there's a K that links really well to this, but we're not necessarily comfortable reading Ks yet. Or, you know, there's a theory shell that I really want to read, but I could probably just do this debate from a disad counterplan perspective. Don't just read things because you feel like you should. Read things that you want to read. If you want to familiarize yourself with Ks, if you want to familiarize yourself with TN theory, reading them is a great way to get that experience. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't read those if you're inexperienced. You absolutely should, but only if you want to. So don't be kind of persuaded just by how strong a link is to do something that you're going to struggle with structurally and systematically, because then you're putting yourself at more of a disadvantage than you if you had just read something like a disad instead. And then don't be afraid to have direct clash. I think that there's sometimes a misconception in LD that if your opponent has a contention that addresses the same content area as one of the disads, you shouldn't read that disad. So for instance, if they have an economy advantage, you shouldn't read an economy disad. But that's not true at all. That's actually one of the best ways to lead to a really strong clash-heavy debate, is to directly go toe-to-toe on some of those issues. So I would almost say that if they read a contention that you have a disad for, you should probably include that disad. That's going to be a great way to kind of get their awareness up, get some strong clash on that flow, and it also means that they're probably going to spend a good amount of time there that might wind up causing them to undercover some of the other flows. So even if it's not a disad you're particularly a fan of, it's still something that could operate as a time suck, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So then think about how your opponent will allocate time. This is a really, really important skill. One of the hardest things to develop in debate is something called round vision, which is the ability to kind of predict how a round will break down, kind of from the first constructive speeches, from the moment you are making debate decisions, that you can kind of already predict what flows are going to come down to, what the weighing is going to look like, and where the judge could possibly vote. So thinking in that kind of macro version of debate is kind of a hard skill to get, and I think one of the greatest ways to start developing that skill is when you're putting together that NC, think about what the 1AR is going to look like. So a good example of that is like what I was just saying with direct clash disads. You know that if you read a disad that directly relates to an advantage of the AF, that they're going to feel an impulse to spend a lot of time there refuting that. So you can consider that and then maybe read another disad that is a lot more link heavy that will also absorb a lot of their time, and then you can really hit them hard on the case level because they're going to be over investing in the disad flows. So you can think kind of in that way. But like I said, this is a difficult skill to develop. So if you can't quite figure out what your opponent's going to do, or if you don't feel comfortable predicting that, if you don't feel good about your predictions yet, just go with whatever you're comfortable with and keep trying to think that way in future rounds. So then this next bullet point is also about round vision. Know what off you are likely going to win on, but be prepared to pivot. So whenever you're putting together an NC doc, you should be thinking in your head, this disad is the disad I'm probably going to go for. This is the one I have the most experience with. This is the one I think is the strongest from an evidence standpoint. So you can have in the back of your head like, oh, I'm definitely going to be going for the militarism K or something like that. But in the case that your opponent all of a sudden has this really incredible prep out to that off, if they have a total like 3-point on every card for your militarism K, be prepared to leave that behind and pivot and focus on something else. So you should be able to kind of predict which off you think you're going to win on, or which off you think you're going to be the best on, but be prepared to kind of pivot on that. Don't be 100% concrete nailed down to that. Otherwise, you're going to put yourself in a bad position whenever your opponent covers it really well. And then one of the things that I think is a good strategic tip, but not always mandatory, is to pick an off that you think will be a time suck. So what I mean by that is you should always read at least one disad. I say always. You should, if you have the opportunity, read an off that is going to be something that your opponent will overinvest time in so that they'll undercover other flows. Normally I put that pretty early on, so chances are your opponent's going to answer the offs in the order that they were read. That's the way that most debaters do it. So if your first off is something like that it has direct clash, or something that is a really high level like tier theory, you should be expecting them to spend a lot of time answering that, and then maybe they won't address the second or third off as thoroughly, and then that second or third off is what you're planning on going for. So putting disads out there that you think that your opponent's going to spend a lot of time on and maybe undercover other flows is always a good strategic tool, but it's something that you can only do if you feel like you have enough strategic flows out there. So if you're only reading 2 offs, don't make one of them a time suck. Make sure that you're reading the 2 best, most strategic offs you can. Which kind of leads to this sub-point that you should never read something that you don't think could win the round. So I say that you can read a disad as a time suck or tier theory as a time suck, but you should always, if you're reading it, you should be able to imagine an NR where you're going for it and you can win the round on it. If you're reading something that can't win you the round, that isn't offense, that you know you're going to lose, you're just wasting your own time. So make sure that even if you're planning on something being a time suck, it's strong enough that you could win on. And then just some specifics for if you're trying to decide between 2 disads that you like or 2 counterplans or whatever. This is kind of the mechanisms that I suggest for each of these types of arguments. So when you're picking a strong disad, think about the impacts first, because disads are going to be really effective insofar as you can weigh them effectively. If you can prove that that impact is the biggest impact in the round and the judge has to look there first, that's going to make a really strong disad. So ideally, all of your disads have strong link evidence. So if you have multiple disads that link and you're trying to pick one, pick the one that you think you can win the weighing debate on. That's, of course, not to say that the link doesn't matter. If you read a disad that doesn't link, you're wasting your own time. But make sure that of the disads that link, you pick the one that can best win the weighing debate. And then when picking counterplans, think about what percentage of the AF you can solve for. So a good counterplan can solve most of the AF. But if you're reading it and it only really solves like 10% of the impact that is discussed in one of the advantages, that counterplan is probably not going to be very persuasive. So you're going to want to read the counterplan that solves for most of what the offense of the AF is. So for instance, if the AF has like an economics advantage and like an economic crash advantage and a poverty advantage and a discrimination advantage or something like that, then you're going to want to read the counterplan that is focused on economics as opposed to the one that is focused on like environmental reform or something like that. So focus on picking a counterplan that meshes well with the offense of the AF. And then when picking Ks, think about the strength of the link. K debates are more often than not going to come down to a link debate. A lot of times the downfall of some early debaters that are familiarizing themselves with Ks is that they'll go really hard for the solvency of the alt and they'll win that the impact is really good. They might even win the roll of the ballot, but they might fall behind on that link debate, at which point they're just talking about some really cool ideas, but they're going to lose the perm. And so having a really strong link not only means that you're going to put your opponent in a much harder position when they're coming up with their 1AR strategy, but it also means that you're going to have an extra shield against the perm arguments that are the downfall of a lot of K debaters. So then when you're picking T or theory, think about strength of violation. So a lot like with K debates, sometimes T and theory can be really great and really persuasive from a standard and voter perspective, but if the violation isn't there, if the interpretation that you read is not something that your opponent is in violation of, the judge is going to have an extremely hard time voting on it. So when you're picking T in theory, you should really think about which interpretation clashes the most with what your opponent actually did. So you should pick the most drastic violation that you can that is available to you. So then some tips about writing case answers, putting together that case part of the document. If you concede framework, you should put like a quick can statement out there, like we both agree that the standard is maximizing expected well-being, vote for the debater who does that best. So something really quick and easy to address the framework, so that way the judge has a clear understanding of what you're doing, but also make it quick enough that you're not wasting your time there. And then if you are contesting framework, if you're reading a counter framework, make sure that you spend at least 30 seconds to a minute on it, because like I said, the framework debate is such an important part of debate that if you really undercover your opponent's framework, if you're not pointing out what's wrong about their framework, you're going to be in really hot water come the NR. Remember, a good framework debate not only explains why your counter framework is good, but why your opponent's framing is bad or morally flawed. So that's what you should be focusing on in this 30 seconds to a minute, is why your opponent's framework is bad and pointing that out to the judge. But when it comes to the case answers, you should always be linking to both frameworks anyway. If you're reading a counter framework, never just assume that you're going to win the framework debate. You should always, whenever you're doing the impact part of your argument, so you have your claim warrant and impact, the impact should be two-parted, saying, this means that under my framing I'm winning. However, even if you don't buy my framework argument, you can still vote for me under my opponent's framework because XYZ. So make sure that you're linking to both frameworks, so that way the framework debate, as important as it is, isn't going to lose you the round. Don't over-rely on carded evidence, especially for defense. Defense, like I mentioned in the basics of response video, defense is not something that's going to win you the round. You win the round by making offense arguments. So if you're reading a bunch of carded evidence takes longer than just making analytical claims. So if you're taking a really long time to make these arguments that aren't even going to win you the round, then you're probably letting too much time go. A lot of people think, I have a bunch of carded responses, I might as well read them, but it's always better to have more arguments on the flow. Now, that's not to say trade off quantity for quality. If you're making arguments that aren't complete, that don't have a claim warrant impact, or that aren't strong arguments, it's probably better to just read the one or two cards. But if you have or have come up with some good extempt arguments or things like that, read those in addition to one card or two cards max. Don't just rattle through as many cards as you can. That not only puts your opponent in a harder position in the 1AR to answer all of those independent arguments, but it also develops your extemping argument skills that will really come in handy for these later rebuttal speeches. And then one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is that the link evidence for disads can function perfectly fine as turns on case if they are strong pieces of link evidence. So for instance, let's say you have a direct clash disad. If your opponent has an environment advantage and you have an environment disad, you can read the link card from that environment disad on case, even if you don't want to read the environment disad. So obviously I'm not saying read the cards twice, but I'm saying if you didn't wind up reading a disad that you think clashes pretty good with the AF, you can use that link as an on-case carded turn. And these are offensive arguments turns, so it's going to be worth your time to make that really strong strategic link turn on the AF. So a lot of times people think, oh, we don't have any carded answers to this, so I don't have any evidence that I can use, when really you can pick apart offs and use those link cards, the disad links or even K links if it's a structural violence related impact, and use those as case turns that are just as effective as ones that were written as block cards. And then try to imagine when you're trying to prioritize what areas to spend the most time on, what to prioritize in your roadmap, what to put first. Think about what AF offense is the strongest and most likely to outweigh. So again, we're probably going to be thinking about impacts here. If your opponent has an advantage that you know that they're probably going to go really hard for in the weighing debate that impacts out to extinction or something like that, then you should probably spend a good amount of time answering that. Or if they have something that they tie extremely directly back to the framework, then you know that's something that they're going to be planning on leaning on in later speeches, so you should spend a lot of time dismantling that. This kind of also helps build your round vision ability to think like your opponent and think about how this round is going to boil down, think about what it's going to look like in later speeches by putting yourself in the shoes of your opponent. And then this is for people that have a little bit of trouble with filler words or leaving extra time on the clock in these case sections of the NC. Leave indications in the document or on the flow to remind you to switch between pre-written and extinct arguments. This might sound like it is doing nothing, but in LD, particularly in these 3-minute rebuttal sections, like the second half of the NC and the 1AR, every second absolutely counts. So if you're saving yourself even just 3 seconds total by leaving these indicators there, that's enough time to fully further develop an argument and turn it from defense into offense, turn it from something that is okay to something that can win you the round. So one of the things that I would do, because I was a debater that preferred to go based on the flow as opposed to the document, is I would put on my flow, like as a dash off to one of the cards that I was answering, I would put read card, and that would remind me to flip my eyes up. I don't even have to look at it and think, what was my argument there going to be? Or look at like the tag of the card I wrote and been like, what was the warrant for that? Oh yeah, it's a card, let me find it. I just looked at it and saw that it was telling me to look back up, and I saved myself 1 to 2 seconds every time that came up. So doing little things like that when you're writing your case answers is a efficient use of the prep time more than you would think, because the 5 seconds of prep time that you would take to do that to save you 3 minutes of speech time is absolutely 100% a trade-off I would suggest taking. So some key takeaways for this video. A disorganized doc can lose you the round. A lot of people don't understand how important putting together an NC document is. The reason I'm taking the time to put a whole video dedicated to it is because it really sometimes can be the difference between winning and losing. So being able to kind of, like I was showing you with the sample document, really easily get to this off-case position, get to this card, answer these questions, and navigate those documents really easily can make a world of difference in these rounds, and also make your extensions a lot cleaner and improve your speaking. It's always worth the prep time to develop that doc and make it cleaner. Sometimes the document is kind of an afterthought in prep time, so you spend all of your prep time working on your flow, and then you just throw together a document in 30 seconds. I would say that that's probably not as effective a use of prep time as taking the extra 20 seconds to organize it and make it look really neat. And then put everything prepared into the document. This is kind of the ethics reminder that we're dealing with case sharing and things that are actually going to happen in the debate space, so you need to consider the debater ethics involved. Put everything prepared in the document. It's not fair to not give your opponent a piece of evidence that you're going to read, or a fully developed typed out analytic or something. It's an issue of fairness and ethics in debate that you should put everything prepared in the document. And then try to imagine what your opponent will do. That's kind of the biggest strategic piece of advice I can give you, is that if you can put yourself in your opponent's shoes and predict their next move, that'll allow you to more strategically balance your time and the arguments you're making. Think about what you would do if you were debating and somebody just got up and read that document that you're about to read, and try to imagine how they're going to spend their time answering it. Never read arguments that can't win the round. If you're reading arguments that are too weak or don't have strong evidence behind them, you're wasting more time than you are burning of your opponents. And then don't over-rely on pre-written things. Extemping arguments is an extremely good skill, and it is extremely important to develop it, but the only way that we can do that is if we kind of lean ourselves off of using all this pre-written evidence all the time and the carded responses and things like that. As strong as carded responses can be, and as good as it is to research those things, we shouldn't be giving entirely card-based rebuttals. Rebuttals should be a time for extemping arguments and developing those extempt skills. So that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching, and I hope it helped.